Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Maurice Obstfeld, former chief economist at the IMF and professor emeritus at Berkeley. Maurice, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate you joining me today to really make sense of this tariff roller coaster we've all been on for the past week and a half. As we know, on Liberation Day, April 2nd, President Trump unveiled his sweeping tariff plan, and the markets reacted swiftly to that. Stocks plunged, trillions of dollars were lost around the globe. This Wednesday, President Trump reversed course. He implemented a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, and he ratcheted up our trade war with China. What is your reaction, and how do you make sense of what's happened in the past week and a half?
President Trump has set out to reshape the world economy in a way that the U.S. has balanced trade with all partners, and that is a fool's errand, if I can put it that way. The U.S. has an overall deficit with the rest of the world because it spends more than it produces. And moreover, that deficit will, if anything, increase as Congress goes ahead with its fiscal plan of cutting taxes and increasing the path of deficits. So President Trump is trying to do something that is not really feasible. And in the process, he's bringing down the world economy. He's destroying trade relationships, which he says he wants to negotiate. The goal of these negotiations is really unclear, and he's probably driving the U.S. into recession. We see this in consumer expectations and business expectations. Early indicators of activity all are pointing downward.
You're saying that this is a fool's errand to reshape the world economy. I mean, what are the implications here? Because as we know, he introduced a tariff plan and he largely rolled that back, largely paused that. So explain what you mean by fool's errand. I mean, what is this going to shake out to be in the short and long term?
Well, the first thing you have to ask is, why does the U.S. engage at all in trading relationships with the rest of the world? And the basic reason is that, the same reason that you engage in trading relationships with a range of economic partners. There are some things you do relatively well. There are other things that others do better. It makes sense for you to specialize on what you do well and to purchase goods and services from those who are better equipped to deliver them. And the same principle applies in international trade. We import vanilla from Madagascar because we can't grow vanilla. Madagascar is too poor to buy a lot of the things that we're good at producing in the U.S., so we have a bilateral trade deficit with Madagascar. That doesn't mean, as President Trump and his team seem to believe, that Madagascar is discriminating against U.S. goods or engaging in unfair trade practices. Now, if you look across the whole range of our trading partners, we have more deficits than surpluses. Again, that's not because they're all cheating in trade. In some cases, there's cheating, but that's not the dominant factor. The dominant factor is that we spend a lot. Our federal government deficit is 6.5% of GDP, more or less. The private sector has a very low personal saving rate, and yet our investment remains pretty robust. So to finance that investment, if we can't finance it out of our domestic saving, it's got to come from the savings of the rest of the world. And so we end up running an overall deficit. The tariffs are not going to change that. Forcing countries to reduce certain non-tariff barriers is not going to change that fact. And if you insist on reducing this deficit through exorbitant tariffs on our trade partners, you may succeed in reducing it by driving the U.S. economy into recession. In other words, by reducing our consumption and investment so much that we actually have a higher trade balance with the rest of the world.
World leaders were swift in their reaction of President Trump's trade policy, essentially saying, hey, America, you don't do this to your friends. It's essentially like the U.S. is holding a gun to all of our allies' friends, saying, hey, you need to come to the table and negotiate or you're going to be stuck with these huge tariffs. What does that type of trading policy do to our partnerships around the globe?
Well, there's a very intimate relationship between trade policy, foreign policy, and the international status of the dollar, for example. When we strike out at our allies, when we indicate to them that our aid, our security assistance, all are contingent on their bowing to our economic demands. That really undermines the global community's trust in the United States as a responsible steward of the world monetary system and the world trade system. And part of its stewardship is the dollar, which is the world's currency, in effect. The closest thing the world has to an international currency is the dollar. It's widely used in markets throughout the world to denominate financial transactions, to invoice trade, and as a reserve currency. And when you undermine belief that the U.S. has strong institutions, that these strong institutions favor responsible international engagement, then people begin to doubt the reliability of the dollar. And in fact, what we've seen in the last week or so, starting a couple of days after Liberation Day, is rising Treasury yields coupled with a sharply depreciating dollar, which is an indication of loss of confidence. Generally, when Treasury yields go up, the dollar strengthens because the rate of return on dollar assets has made the dollar a more attractive store of value. But if the world is basically selling off treasuries and selling off U.S. assets because they've lost confidence, then the yield on treasuries has to rise to persuade people to keep holding them, and the dollar is going to fall. And that's what we've been seeing in markets for the last few days.
Can you talk about a little bit more the long-term impacts of that? What will happen long-term when around the globe people are doubting the reliability of the dollar?
Well, long-term, I think countries will try to separate themselves from the dollar system. Foreign corporations, foreign banks will be less likely to borrow in dollars than they are now, just because the reliability of the U.S. is in question. It'll also be the case that the interest rates at which the U.S. can borrow, at which the federal government can finance itself, are going to rise. And that's going to make the deficits of the federal government, which seem set to increase, even more expensive to finance over time. That puts the U.S. fiscal position in a perilous spot.
I want to now turn to the U.S. trade war with China, because when President Trump announced the pause on the reciprocal tariffs, he also announced that he was ratcheting up tariffs on Chinese imports to 125%. The White House clarified those were at now 145%. China retaliated with 125% tariffs of their own. What do you think of this tit-for-tat trade war with China, with the two world's biggest economies here?
Well, the U.S. and China have begun a process of decoupling. This really started in the first Trump term, and so trade with China is less than what it was, say, 8 years ago. On the other hand, it remains pretty extensive. And it's a two-way street. We do have a very big deficit with China, but we import items from them that we absolutely need, such as rare earth minerals, pharmacological precursors. They're a very important source for those commodities, and those are essential to several of our industries. It's also true that a lot of small businesses in the U.S. absolutely depend on Chinese inputs, and if you raise the price of those by 145%, it's hard to see how those businesses can stay in business, at least at the levels that currently prevail. And those businesses employ workers. They're going to have to lay those workers off. It's not a really pretty picture at all. So the trade war comes with significant costs for us. Also costs for China, but China's politics are very different from ours. Just take an example. Farmers in the U.S. are getting hammered by Chinese trade barriers. Back in the first Trump administration, that happened. Trump's administration then deployed $28 billion in relief payments to farmers. These are being discussed again. But you can't go around paying everyone off to compensate them for the negative effects of tariffs. It may be that you compensate farmers to some degree because they're in critical states with Republican senators. You can't compensate everyone. You can't compensate all the small businesses that are going to go under. And even the farmers say, look, we don't really want compensation. We'll take it, but we'd rather, have strong export markets. And there's long-term damage. After the last round of trade wars in Trump's first term, China substantially shifted its soybean demand to Brazil. That hasn't come back. Now their demand is probably going to just dry up completely because they simply can't rely on the U.S. as a source of agricultural goods if they're going to have to be responding to tariffs like the ones that Trump has imposed.
I want to read a quote that you wrote in The Economist pre-pause about President Trump's tariff policies. This is what you wrote. Trump won the 2024 election by convincing voters that his policies, tariffs included, would produce butter, lower prices, growth of manufacturing jobs, all without economic pain. The reality that Liberation Day revealed is different. The president has launched a costly, all-front assault to restructure the global trading system. It has already caused the odds of recession to jump. Now we're sitting here post-pause, but while recession fears were stoked when the tariff policy was announced, post-pause, people are still scared about a recession. They're saying, hey, the odds are still just as high or almost just as high. Where do you think we are in terms of a recession? Do you think we're still heading in that direction?
I would say the odds are significantly better than 50-50. I know that some forecasters sharply reduced their odds after the pause, but look where we are. The trade war with China has only escalated. We still have tariffs on autos, on steel, on aluminum. These are really going to be crippling for several industries. We have a general 10% tariff, which has remained in effect, which is going to raise costs across the board. And, the perception after the initial relief from the pause is that the administration goals are pretty unrealistic. The idea of meaningfully negotiating a reduction in trade barriers with a large range of countries in a period of 90 days is just not realistic. So you very quickly have to look at the end game. Where will we be in 90 days? There's no certainty that trade deals will be reached. It's not even clear what the Trump administration is asking for. Are they going to ask Europe to dismantle its value-added tax? Europe isn't going to do that. So where are we going to be 3 months hence? Meanwhile, one of the main causes of the recession forecasts, which is the huge uncertainty about trade policy that continues to spook consumers and deter investment, that remains in place. So, thankfully, the sort of immediate, I would say, not very well motivated, but very high Liberation Day tariffs have been paused. But there's huge uncertainty about where we go from here. And of course, some of our trade partners also paused their retaliation for 90 days, but that very much remains on the table. So I think we're very much on edge, and the economy is very much on edge about where we go from here.
And despite the pause, we're still seeing the highest tariffs since the Great Depression. So I know that we have 90 days, a little less now because the 90-day pause was announced just a few days ago. But what specifically are you looking out for between now and then? And I do know there is a ton of uncertainty, but are there any signals, any indicators that you're looking for?
Well, I'd like to see how negotiations proceed. So far, we literally know nothing other than the vague assurances that large numbers of trade partners are approaching the U.S. looking for deals, but the likelihood that those deals make any progress, I think, is very unclear. I'm also looking at how the asset markets react in terms of assessing recession prospects. I think the bond market is incredibly important. I think these spikes in treasury yields are very negative for the economy. And I think the we focused a lot on the trade war in terms of the treasury yields, but I think not enough attention has been paid to what is going on in Congress in terms of advancing the president's budgetary priorities. Congress is preparing a large package of tax cuts. They're claiming that these really aren't tax cuts because of their argument that extending the 2017 cuts is not a cut, but it is a cut in terms of CBO practice and in terms of CBO forecasts of the deficit's path. What they're doing is basically pretending that they're not raising deficits down the road and undermining the norms of the reconciliation process that have been followed up until this point. And all of that is very negative for the U.S. fiscal position. If the U.S. is going to be pumping out all of this debt into the world in the next couple of years, that's going to push yields up. I think the markets are anticipating that. And if that happens in an environment of a trade war where countries, especially China, which is a very large holder, become much more reluctant to buy treasury debt, that's going to be very negative for bond prices and treasury yields. So I think that's something to watch going forward. There's a real negative feedback loop between Congress's budgetary negotiations and the trade war. And I suspect one of the reasons why the president backed down so quickly when bond yields spiked is because, on that very day, his administration was trying to persuade several holdout Republicans in the House to back the budget plan. So these developments fit together. They're all negative for bond prices, and I would hope that our policymakers in Washington recognize that the fiscal position is fragile, and the fragility is magnified by what's going on in the trade sphere.
Well, there is certainly a lot to keep our eye out for, and especially as the budget negotiations continue to play out. I hope you come back on and join me. Maurice Obstfeld, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you.